Today we're delving into another chapter in the West Virginia Mine Wars, the Battle of Matewan, West Virginia. Hello folks, I'm Steve Gilley, along with Rod Mullins, and this is another one of the stories of Appalachia.
Steve, when I was growing up, I'd never heard of Matewan until around 1988, 89, somewhere in there. And that's when John Sayles' movie, Matewan, really got popular. I think it's about the time the Pittston strike was going on. And here's this movie out about the struggles between coal operators and coal miners trying to unionize. And the story of Matewan is a really interesting story, and it's also got a lot of action. There's a lot of gunfire. There's a lot of different things going on in this whole story we're about to tell you.
This story, Rod, was one that I guess you could say it was kind of kept hush-hush for a lot of years.
Yes.
Because I do not remember studying this in school, and like you, it was probably the late 80s before I first heard of this entire incident. Now it's very common that folks know about this. And it's a very good story. It's a very important story in the labor movement in the coal fields in West Virginia. On May 19th, 1920, the quiet town of Matewan, situated at the confluence of the Tug Fork and Mate Creek on the border with Kentucky, became the epicenter of a violent struggle between coal miners and coal operators. Let's start this story, though, with a bit of context. During this time, union organizing was in full swing, with John L. Lewis freshly elected as the president of the United Mine Workers of America. Miners in other parts of the country had already gone on a 2-month strike, achieving a remarkable 27% pay increase. But in southern West Virginia, southwest Virginia, and eastern Kentucky, the coal mines were not yet unionized. The UMWA was making its move into those areas, and that's where our story unfolds.
Well, Steve, it's important to note at this time, coal camps were the norm, and companies held tremendous power over their workers. Miners were often paid in company scrip, not cash, not anything else, but scrip, which could only be used at company stores. This system gave the coal operators local clout and allowed them to keep wages low. Miners were paid by the ton, and the companies often tipped the scales to hold the pay down. And if miners were suspected even of any kind of union activity, they faced eviction from company housing. To enforce these evictions, coal operators hired the infamous, yes, that's right, infamous Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, a group known for their aggressive tactics and sometimes, let's go a little bit further, their barbaric tactics. Among this backdrop of tension, over 3,000 miners in the Matewan area signed up for the union in the spring of 1920. In response, the coal operators retaliated with mass firings and evictions.
And of course, it was the, as you said, the infamous Baldwin Felts Detective Agency that was tasked with doing all that and tossing those miners and their families out in the cold. But enter Sid Hatfield, the town's police chief, who played a central role in this story. Now, he was a man with a rough and rowdy past, descended from Devil Anse Hatfield's grandfather's half-brother. Despite his colorful history, he was named chief by Matewan Mayor Cable Testerman. Hatfield was a staunch supporter of the UMWA, but tensions were simmering, and the stage was set for a tragic incident. And that incident unfolded on May 19th, 1920. A group of Baldwin Felts detectives arrived in Matewan on the number 29 train, tasked with evicting families from the Stone Mountain coal camp. Hatfield and his deputy met them at the train station.
Well, these detectives were armed to the teeth with satchels containing Thompson submachine guns and pistols on their belts. Albert Felts, one of the detectives, led the group. Hatfield and Burgraff confronted them, asking what they were doing there. Now, when we're talking about Burgraff, we're talking about Fred Burgraff, who was a deputy to Sid Hatfield. Well, the detectives went about their grim task, but upon returning to town for lunch and departure, Sid Hatfield declared his intention to arrest all of them with Baldwin Felts. This decision sent shockwaves throughout the town, and tension skyrocketed. Well, you guessed it, a shot was fired, and to this day it's unclear who fired the first shot. It's sort of like Han and Greedo in Star Wars. Who fired the first shot? Who shot who? Well, Hatfield claimed that Albert Felts fired from under his raincoat, shooting Mayor Testerman in the stomach. However, members of the Felts party argued that Hatfield shot the mayor to claim his widow. Now, I have to say this too, Steve. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that Mayor Testerman also owned a jewelry store there in Matewan. At least that's what I remember from the movie. But yes, I can kind of go along with that, because I take it that his widow, or at that time soon-to-be widow, very attractive young lady too. And so the argument was that Hatfield ended up shooting the mayor to claim his widow, which he later married.
Later being within months.
Yes.
That's how soon it happened. Anyway, what followed after this shooting was chaos. Gunfire erupted throughout the town, and Albert Felts made a run for the post office with Hatfield in hot pursuit. Hatfield called on him to come out and face him like a man, but Felts refused. So shots were exchanged, and Hatfield ultimately killed Felts. The townspeople, fearing for their lives, fled across the Tug River into Kentucky to escape the violence. Tragically, one man used a jug of chloroform taken from a doctor's office as a weapon, killing another in the chaos. In the aftermath, 7 Baldwin Felts detectives, including 2 Felts brothers, were killed, and another was wounded. 2 miners lost their lives, and Mayor Testerman succumbed to his injuries. 4 others were wounded.
Well, the governor, in the meantime, ordered the state police to take control of Matewan, and Hatfield became something of a local folk hero, about the best way you can say it. But the story doesn't end here. A strike was called on July 1st, leading to more violence, including the bombing of railroad cars and brutal attacks on strikers. In the meantime, a grand jury indicted Sid Hatfield and 22 others for the deaths of Albert Felts. Now, the trial took place in January of 1921 in Williamson, West Virginia, where Sid Hatfield was ultimately acquitted.
But, Rod, sadly, the tale of Sid Hatfield took a tragic turn. He and his deputy, Ed Chambers, faced criminal charges in an incident in which a coal temple was blown up in Mohawk. On August 1st, 1921, Baldwin Felts detectives, who were lying in wait, assassinated Hatfield and Ed Chambers, his deputy, on the steps of the McDowell County Courthouse in Welch. Hatfield died instantly, and Chambers was coldly finished off with a bullet to the head, with Charles Everett Lively, a detective, claiming self-defense. The shocking event drew 3,000 mourners to their funeral and set the stage for the next incident, the famous Battle of Blair Mountain.
I have to tell you this, Steve. I've been at a couple of these historical presentations, and there has been at least one gentleman that I know of that has made presentations. He has been so heavily cited with the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency. Oh my gosh, at one time I wanted to just go and throw up, because I just couldn't take it anymore of how he was bragging on them. But they were cold-blooded. I mean, there was no other way around it. And then you look at the miners, well, they had to be cold-blooded to match the cold-bloodedness of the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, these hired hands. And, you know, this wasn't just the first time we would see hired guns to come into a strike. It happened also in 1989 through about, 1990, 91 with the Pittston strike. So, I mean, no stranger to this kind of thing, and no stranger to these kind of tactics. And, yes, some propaganda in there about they did it, and nobody really knows. It's just something they pointed fingers at.
Well, they didn't call it the Mine Wars for nothing. I mean, this was an actual war. There were people shooting each other from both sides. Probably some of the worst violence in the coal fields in these labor wars, with the UNWA and the coal companies. That was the West Virginia mine wars. This, though, did set the stage for probably the very worst of it, and that is the Battle of Blair Mountain, which we'll tell you about here in a few weeks. This is, this is a big part of coal country's history. I mean, a huge part. And it's something that we as a podcast want to make sure that gets out there and people know about this as best possible.
Yeah, and I also have to say, too, you mentioned earlier when we were talking about this of West Virginia, Southwest Virginia, some of the other areas, even on down into eastern Kentucky, down to Harlan County. This was kind of the cascade effect. This was almost like water rolling down a bunch of rocks in the stream. It started at one place with a big surge, and then it started rolling down even further, and it kind of did it geographically is what it ended up doing. Southwest Virginia ended up, becoming unionized in many places. I had a grandfather that could tell the stories of when they were trying to unionize at Clinchgo, and, miners with guns and hired guns up on the hill and stuff behind them and so forth. It was not a very safe time to be a person wanting to go and bring the union in, and likewise, it wasn't a safe time for anybody if you were affiliated with Baldwin Felts. You were instantly almost like an enemy of the state, so to speak.
And that, folks, is the gripping tale of the Battle of Matewan, a pivotal moment in the history of this place we call home. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the Stories Podcast at Spreaker, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, or on your favorite podcast app. We're on TikTok and YouTube at Stories of Appalachia and on Instagram at Story Appalachia. Be sure to follow us there. Till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.